Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and he thought he had developed the emotional capacity to handle virtually any situation that arose on stage. He had witnessed confessions that shocked audiences, heard testimonies of sacrifice that moved millions to tears, and listened to stories that had challenged everything he thought he knew about family, love, and the choices people make under impossible circumstances. But on that cold February afternoon in 2026, an 81-year-old grandfather named William Bill Henderson would share something so quietly devastating, so profoundly heartbreaking in its revelation of a life-altering decision made decades ago that he had never stopped regretting, that Steve would stop the show entirely. Not pause it, but bring everything to a complete halt, because what was being confessed was so raw and so painful that continuing with a game show felt obscene in the face of such genuine human anguish. 2 families stood ready to compete, the Morrison family from Ohio and the Henderson family from Pennsylvania. The Henderson family drew immediate attention because at their center stood William Henderson, a frail 81-year-old man with wispy white hair, watery blue eyes that held profound sadness, and a stooped posture that suggested someone carrying an invisible weight that had bent him over the years. He wore a worn cardigan over a flannel shirt, moved very slowly with a walker, and had an expression of grim determination mixed with barely suppressed grief. His family surrounded him with obvious love but also visible tension. His daughter Patricia, who was in her late 50s, his son-in-law Robert, his granddaughter Emily, who was in her early 30s, and Emily's 2 young children who seemed confused by their great-grandfather's obvious distress. During the pre-interview, William had been quiet and withdrawn, answering questions in brief, halting sentences, and the producers had noticed he seemed to be struggling with whether to go through with something. When asked why he wanted to be on the show, he had said something that immediately raised concerns. "I'm 81 years old, and I'm dying. I have congestive heart failure, and my doctors say I have maybe 6 months, maybe less. And I can't die without telling my daughter the truth about something I did when she was a baby, something I've never told her, something I've regretted every single day for 58 years. I need to tell her before I die, and I'm doing it here, publicly, because if I try to tell her privately, I'll lose my courage. This is the hardest thing I'll ever do, but I have to do it." William's daughter Patricia, when asked what her father might reveal, had spoken with obvious concern and confusion, saying, "My father told me 2 weeks ago that he needs to confess something to me, something about my childhood that he's kept secret for my entire life. He won't tell me what it is. He says he needs to tell me in a setting where he can't back out, where there are witnesses. I'm terrified of what he's going to say. My father has always been distant with me, loving but somehow removed, and I've never understood why. I've always felt like there was something between us, some invisible barrier I couldn't identify. Now he's dying, and he says he needs to tell me the truth before it's too late. I don't know if I'm ready to hear it." The Henderson family won their game, though William did not participate in the playing, sitting in a chair that had been brought for him, clearly lacking the physical strength to stand at the buzzers. As they lined up for fast money, it was obvious that William would not be playing the game. He was breathing with difficulty, his hands shaking violently, his face showing the strain of simply being present. But William had struggled to his feet anyway, using his walker, and had insisted on making his way to the podium. Production staff had quickly arranged for a tall stool for him to lean against, and as William slowly, painfully made his way to center stage, the studio fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Steve approached William with careful gentleness, immediately recognizing that this elderly man was in distress, and said softly, "Mr. Henderson, sir, you don't need to do anything you don't want to do. You can rest. We can." But William shook his head with surprising firmness and said in a voice that was weak but determined, "No, Mr. Harvey. I've waited 58 years to do this. I'm not waiting any longer. I need to tell my daughter what I did, what I've hidden from her, and why I've been a failure as a father her entire life." Steve's expression shifted immediately to one of serious concern, and he said quietly, "Sir, tell us what you need to tell us." The studio fell silent, and William turned to face his daughter Patricia. Tears were already streaming down his weathered face as he said, "Patricia, I need to tell you about your mother, about what happened when you were born, about a choice I made that has haunted me every day since, and about why I've never been the father you deserved." Patricia's face showed immediate alarm, and she said, "Dad, what are you talking about? Mom died when I was a baby. You've told me that my whole life." William nodded and said, "Yes, your mother died when you were 6 months old in 1968. That part is true. But what I've never told you is how she died and what I did when she was dying and the choice I made that I've spent 58 years regretting." The studio remained in absolute silence, everyone transfixed by William's obvious anguish. He continued, his voice shaking, "Your mother's name was Helen. We got married in 1966 when I was 24 and she was 23. You were born in January 1968. Your mother had complications during childbirth, severe hemorrhaging that the doctors initially got under control, but which caused internal damage. 6 months after you were born, in July 1968, your mother collapsed at home. I called an ambulance, and they rushed her to the hospital. The doctors discovered that she had developed a life-threatening infection related to the childbirth complications, and they said she needed emergency surgery immediately or she would die within hours." William paused, struggling to breathe, and Steve moved closer to him, ready to provide support if needed. William said, "But there was a problem. The surgery was risky. The doctors told me that your mother had about a 30% chance of surviving the surgery, but without it, she had 0 chance. They needed my permission to proceed, because your mother was unconscious and couldn't consent. And they told me something else. They told me that even if the surgery was successful, your mother would likely have severe complications, would probably need long-term care, might not be able to function independently again. They were honest with me about how serious the situation was." William's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and he said, "And I made a decision I've regretted every single moment of every single day for 58 years. I told the doctors not to do the surgery. I told them to let your mother die." The collective gasp and cry of horror from the audience was immediate and visceral, and Patricia's face went completely white. Steve stood frozen, his mouth open in shock, unable to process what he had just heard. William continued through his sobs, "I was 26 years old. I had a 6-month-old baby. My wife was unconscious and dying, and the doctors were telling me that even if she survived the surgery, she would need constant care, would probably be disabled, would require resources I didn't have. And I panicked. I was terrified of being left with a baby and a wife who needed full-time care. I was terrified of the medical bills, of the responsibility, of my entire life being consumed by caregiving, so I made the most selfish, cowardly decision of my life. I told the doctors not to do the surgery. I let your mother die, Patricia. I chose to let her die rather than face the possibility of caring for her if she survived with complications." Patricia had collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing, and the entire studio was in shock. William said, "Your mother died 2 hours later, never regaining consciousness, never knowing that I had chosen to let her go rather than fight for her. And for 58 years, I've lived with the knowledge that I killed my wife through inaction, that I chose my own comfort over her life, that I was too much of a coward to care for her the way she deserved. That's why I've been distant with you your entire life, Patricia. Because every time I look at you, I see Helen. I see the woman I let die because I was selfish and afraid. I see the mother you should have had, but didn't because I didn't fight for her." Steve finally found his voice and said, "Stop. We need to stop everything right now." He turned to the producers and said firmly, "Stop filming. Stop all of this. We need to stop." The cameras cut, and for 20 minutes the studio was in chaos. Patricia sobbing inconsolably, William collapsed in his chair, barely able to breathe, medical personnel attending to both of them, Steve standing to the side with his hand over his mouth, looking absolutely shattered. When filming resumed, the atmosphere had completely changed. This was no longer a game show. It was something far more serious and somber. Steve sat on a stool facing William and Patricia, who were sitting together, Patricia still crying but more controlled. Steve said very gently, "Mr. Henderson, I need to understand what you're saying. You're telling us that when your wife was dying and needed emergency surgery, you told the doctors not to perform the surgery because you were afraid of the burden of caring for her if she survived with complications. And she died as a result. William nodded and said, "Yes, Mr. Harvey. That's exactly what I'm saying. I murdered my wife through inaction. I chose to let her die rather than risk having to care for her. And I've lived with that guilt every day since. I destroyed my daughter's chance to have a mother because I was selfish and cowardly." Patricia, through her tears, said, "Dad, why are you telling me this now? Why did you keep this from me for 58 years? William looked at his daughter with infinite sadness and said, "Because I was ashamed. Because I couldn't face what I had done. Because telling you meant admitting that I was responsible for you growing up without a mother. But I'm dying now, and I realized I can't die without you knowing the truth. You deserve to know why your mother isn't here, and I deserve to finally confess what I did, even though confession can't undo it." Steve said carefully, "Mr. Henderson, I need to ask you something. You said the doctors told you the surgery had about a 30% chance of success. That means there was a 70% chance your wife would die even with the surgery. Is that correct?" William nodded and said, "Yes, that's correct. But 30% is still a chance. I took that chance away from her. I chose certainty of her death over possibility of her survival because I was afraid of what her survival might mean for me." Steve turned to Patricia and said gently, "Patricia, do you want to respond?" "You don't have to. No one expects you to have words for this right now." Patricia looked at her father for a long moment, her face showing a terrible mixture of grief, anger, confusion, and something that might have been compassion. Finally, she said, "Dad, I don't know how to feel about this. I'm angry that you've lied to me for 58 years about how Mom died. I'm devastated to learn that you made a choice that led to her death. But I'm also trying to understand that you were 26 years old, terrified, facing an impossible situation. I don't know if what you did was murder or just a terrible decision made under extreme pressure. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I don't hate you, Dad. I'm heartbroken." William reached out and took his daughter's hand, and he said through his tears, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Patricia. I don't deserve anything but your anger, but I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to understand that the distance you've always felt from me, the barrier between us, it was my guilt, my shame, my inability to look at you without seeing the woman I let die. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved. I'm sorry I let my guilt prevent me from loving you the way I should have. And I'm sorry I waited until I'm dying to tell you the truth." The episode that eventually aired weeks later, after extensive ethical review and with heavy content warnings, became one of the most controversial programs in television history. The decision to air Williams' confession sparked intense debates about whether it was appropriate to broadcast, someone admitting to what some viewed as essentially letting their spouse die, about the ethics of deathbed confessions that devastate families, and about whether this was something that should have remained private. The response was deeply divided. Some viewers expressed sympathy for William, viewing him as a young man faced with an impossible choice who had spent 58 years being tortured by guilt. Others condemned him as selfish and cowardly, arguing that he had essentially killed his wife to avoid the burden of caring for her. Medical ethicists used Williams' case to discuss the complexities of medical decision-making for incapacitated patients, noting that while Williams' motives were questionable, surrogates making difficult end-of-life decisions for loved ones face impossible situations. Patricia and her father spent Williams' final 5 months working through the revelation in family therapy. Patricia later said in interviews that while she struggled with anger and grief about what her father had done, she ultimately came to understand that he had been a young man facing a terrifying situation and had made a choice he'd regretted for the rest of his life. She said, "My father lived in hell for 58 years because of the choice he made. He punished himself far more than I ever could, and while I wish he'd made a different choice, while I wish I'd had my mother, I also see that he was young and terrified and human. I'm working toward forgiveness, though I'm not there yet." William Henderson died in July 2026, 5 months after his confession. In his final weeks, he spoke extensively about the relief he felt having finally told the truth, even though the truth had caused tremendous pain. He said, "I don't feel forgiven, and I don't expect to be forgiven. But I feel lighter having finally told Patricia what I did." Carrying that secret for 58 years was its own kind of death, a slow suffocation of the soul. Confessing didn't erase what I did, but it allowed me to die having at least been honest about it. At William's funeral, Patricia gave a eulogy that captured the terrible complexity of his life and his confession. She said, "My father made a terrible decision when he was 26 years old. He chose to let my mother die rather than risk the burden of caring for her if she survived with complications. That decision meant I grew up without a mother, and it meant my father lived for 58 years consumed by guilt and shame. Both things are true. He made a selfish choice, and he was tortured by it for the rest of his life. I don't know if I fully forgive him, but I understand that he was human, that he was young and terrified, and that he carried unbearable guilt for decades. I'm grateful he told me the truth before he died, even though the truth is painful. And I'm grateful for the 5 months we had after his confession, where we could finally be honest with each other about the barrier that had always been between us." The story of William Henderson and his devastating confession became a powerful and controversial testimony about impossible medical decisions, the weight of guilt carried for decades, and the question of whether deathbed confessions that devastate families are acts of courage or cruelty. It raised difficult questions about how we judge people who make terrible decisions under extreme pressure, about whether living with guilt for decades constitutes sufficient punishment, and about whether confessing painful truths is a gift or a burden to those who have to live with those truths after the confessor is gone. But perhaps most significantly, William's confession became a reminder that the choices we make in moments of crisis can haunt us for entire lifetimes, that guilt can become a prison from which we never escape, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is confess what we've done even when confession can't undo the harm and will only cause more pain to those we love. As William said in one of his final interviews, "I let my wife die 58 years ago because I was afraid of the burden of caring for her. I've lived in hell ever since, punishing myself in ways no court ever could. Confessing what I did didn't free me from guilt. I died guilty, but it freed me from the exhaustion of hiding, from the isolation of carrying that secret alone, and it gave Patricia the truth she deserved about her mother. That's all I had to give her before I died, the truth about what I did and why she grew up without a mother. It's a terrible gift, maybe even a cruel one, but it's the only honest thing I had left to offer."